managers don't actively opt into being leaders because they love leading. A lot of people don't actually share what they're doing outside of the normal working hours. So there's not necessarily visibility that this is happening.
Our today's guest is Sarah Hamilton-Gill, business growth mentor, published author, podcast host, and speaker at Leap into HR Consulting. She is also the founder, managing director, and consultant at GlobusHR Consulting Ltd. With over 32 years in HR, Sarah has cracked the code on escaping corporate burnout. She's launched over 300 independent HR consulting businesses in just 5 years through the UK's only CPD accredited bootcamp.
Is there something that can be done to create space for these kinds of energies in organisations, do you think?
Typically, they kind of love what they do, but then you've got all of the other elements that come in. I actually think it's a really tough world to be a leader in right now.
Hi Sarah, welcome to The Power Between.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. Thanks, Roddy.
It's great to have you, Sarah. You have a role and lead a company, Leap into HR Consulting, that I think has a big encouragement on getting people with HR experience to come out of the big organizations and do the individual or more entrepreneurial-led HR consulting. And that's an interesting sort of insight to have anyway. But explain to me a little bit about how you've arrived in this position and what got you there. I'm guessing that there was probably a bit of that yourself.
Absolutely. So prior to going into consulting myself, which is actually my 32nd year in consulting, I was in the corporate world as an HR professional within the retail sector in the UK. So fast and furious, all sorts of challenges that you face as an in-house HR professional. This was back in the 90s. And we didn't have the advantage of technology like we do today. But I then set up my consulting business. I grew that over a long period of time. And then the last 5 years, I've been helping the many HR professionals that are looking to move out of the corporate world and set their own businesses up. They've just simply had enough.
And I think we'll come to that concept, that idea of people having enough, and I really want to explore it. But I mean, it's interesting that transition too. So from being embedded in organizations to doing the pure HR consulting, and now to an extent sort of being support for HR consultants or people transitioning in. So I mean, the focus through that is very clear. There's a strong thread, isn't there? And it's always around the people and people who are interested in people, I suppose, because that's what HR is. Have you seen that sort of in other aspects of your lives? Maybe what drew you into it in the first place?
I guess for me, I mean, when I first went into consulting, there was no such thing as HR consulting. It was management consultants that had HR specialists. The whole boutique HR consulting didn't exist back in the 1990s. I think for me, there were two things that excited me about consulting. Not that I knew much about it when I kind of first went into it, but it was the variety. The challenges. I love challenges, love variety. And for me, corporate world was way too slow, too much bureaucracy, too many politics for me. And I realized many years later that was just never going to work for me. So it was a good move for me.
And do you think, I mean, you say you've been doing this for a number of decades now. Has that changed too much? I mean, I still get a sense that big organizations find it very, very difficult. Let go of the bureaucracy and politics comes along with that too. And it's never built into the culture in a sort of proactive fashion, but it inevitably appears in organizations.
I think because there's been a bit of a shift in the private sector predominantly, which is where I focus, there aren't so many large corporates, I think, nowadays. If you look at the UK marketplace, it's nearly 90% SMEs. So the fact that it's an SME, there tends to be slightly less of this going on. It's still alive and kicking in the large corporates, very much so.
With the best will in the world, I think it's very difficult for large corporates to disentangle themselves from it, because if you've got a large organization, you need to put in processes, and processes one way or another tend to lead to those kinds of things. But that's interesting what you say. I mean, is most of the work that you were doing as a HR consultant with mid-sized organizations then?
It was a whole variety. So I started off with small kind of privately owned businesses. over the years, I then moved into larger corporate clients and the public sector. So I've covered most bases in the last 30 years, and everything from startups to kind of thousands of employees. So the interesting thing is that some of the themes are very similar. So it doesn't necessarily matter where you are, that the people issues are still very, very similar, particularly at a leadership level.
People tend to be people regardless of which organization they go or sector they go into, and the way that we interact with each other has a certain rhythm and pattern to it, I think, regardless of whether you're an accountant or an engineer or a scientist or in healthcare or whatever it may be. So, I mean, what are you seeing as the big challenges then, the people aspect of HR? Because I mean, I know there's lots of regulation too, and perhaps we disambiguate the regulatory part from the people management part, focus more on the people management. What are you seeing as
Some of the kind of big issues at the moment, I think, particularly when I'm talking to my community of HR consultants who then also have their big networks of clients that they're working with. I think one of the biggest challenges at the moment is the complete overload that managers and leaders face in terms of just day-to-day stuff. So I was doing some research. I'll have a look at my notes here. One of the things that came out is that, how are you going to implement a strategy when managers are so overloaded with things like admin, meetings, the opportunity to actually lead is kind of just micro. It's, by the time you've done everything else, how can you possibly be a really good leader? So there is a kind of a sense right now that managers are stepping down. They don't want to be leaders anymore. They're going back to being the technical experts, or they're trying to move into roles where they don't have to lead people. It's not just all the other disciplines. I hear it in HR as well. HR people that are supposed to like people do not want to be managing teams of people. And I get it. I get it. It's a big part of any role.
well, it is an exhausting part, and lots of effort needs to be put into it. And I sometimes think that we fail to appreciate that leadership roles are really draining. That you're always
Yeah.
on in a leadership role. If you're responsible for looking after people and ensuring, in our definition that we use here at Ideas for Leaders, you're creating the conditions for people to do their best work in. That means you've got to look after them in all aspects of their lives. That's a ceaseless roundabout that needs to keep on being turned. And I don't know whether people think of leadership in those terms when they think about, I'm going to take on a leadership role. They think about it as having more power, more influence, more ability to change things, perhaps, but not necessarily the the work that goes with it.
Absolutely. And when I was getting some feedback ready for this podcast, what made me laugh a little bit is the kind of concept that managers don't actively opt into being leaders because they love leading. Typically, they're opting in because it's the next rung of the career ladder, or it sounds good. They've been promoted, and it sounds good on their CV. Often, and I did a lot of work with the telecoms industry, and what we found there was a lot of the technical experts were so good at their jobs that they then got promoted into these leadership roles, and they hated the leadership element of it, and quite often didn't get any more remuneration for it, and ended up going back into being the technical expert
Interesting.
because their skill set, and leadership's a skill set, it's not a job title. So it's a capability, it's a skill set. And if you haven't got that personality as well, necessarily to be a good leader, and every context is different, then there's an element that they'll shrink back into being their technical expert and not want to go there again.
That's a great observation, and it's one that we need to keep reminding ourselves about, because it happens. It seems to me that it happens very frequently. That is the route that people go, and it's not necessarily the route they really really want to be on.
Yes. But sadly, they don't find out they don't really want it until they're actually in the role.
So what can we do then about that?
Right. So I think there's a lot that we can do. And I think part of it is just analyzing what actually is happening with leaders' time. I mean, it comes down to the real absolute basics. How are people spending their time? Again, we've got the absolute advantage of AI. So some of these repetitive things are eating into the leader's time. How can we utilize AI to take some of the repetitive, time consuming things away from their roles? Um, and there are plenty of things that can give you back some time by doing that. But I think unless companies kind of take stock of what the leaders are actually doing and how better they can manage that time, they're never going to have the headspace. Or the other thing is they might get things delivered, but they'll have burnout because they're doing it outside of normal working hours just to keep up.
It's interesting, isn't it? I was on a train. I'm based up in Edinburgh. I was on a train back up from London quite late last night. It was an 8:30 train leaving London, and I looked across, and there was a chap sitting on the other side of the aisle from me, and it must have been 10:30 at night, and he was on his laptop, and he was definitely doing work. I don't know what he was doing, but there was graphs and text and stuff that he was playing around with, and it crossed my mind. I don't suppose that was part of his commissioned working hours, and I suspect that goes on a huge amount.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people don't actually share what they're doing outside of the normal working hours. So there's not necessarily visibility. This is happening. I mean, if I take my case, for example, we've got a lot of changes taking place in the business, lots of products and services that we're launching. I certainly don't stop at 6 o'clock at night. Last night you'd have seen me on the laptop near enough at midnight because that's when I do some of my best work, when it's peace and quiet, no interruptions, and I can crack on. But that's not sustainable. And I think a lot of leaders are also doing this and just to keep up.
And I think there's a difference. I mean, I'm to say I do much better creative work at sort of between 5 and 9 o'clock in the evening is when it suits me to do that. But I'm my own boss to a large extent, so I'm not doing it under anyone else's whip other than my own, and that's a very different sort of environment to be in than to be feeling I've got to get this out by tomorrow morning because that's what's expected of me from upstairs.
So I think one of the things that CEOs can definitely do is, take stock of what leadership development are they actually giving to their teams. Because we go through phases when business isn't doing so well, typically the budget for training gets cut. But leadership development, if you haven't got good, well-trained leaders and managers, the rest of it kind of all falls apart. So what are the CEOs doing to enable their leaders to lead and their managers to manage properly? I think is a really important thing to consider. And there's always a good ROI on that.
Yeah. The phrase I've increasingly used these days is silent sabotage. And
Oh,
we're
yes. Yeah.
silently sabotaging our organizations by not focusing on that leadership development, not creating the space for that, because there's always something more pressing in a transactional way to be achieved, and you can always leave the development tomorrow. My father grew up in a small town down the coast from here in Scotland, and there was a shoemaker's, and he had which used to have a notice in the window that said "shoes mended free tomorrow," because tomorrow never comes.
Brilliant.
And I like that idea.
Yeah,
we're
very
always putting
good.
stuff off to tomorrow, but tomorrow never comes.
Yeah. And some of the things that are happening right now, I'm just looking at some of the kind of snippets that I've been given. Managers, like I said earlier, they're not resigning, but they're saying they don't want promotions. It's not worth it for them. We've got people that are, very stressed. Obviously, performance kind of drops off and low engagement. So, there are some huge risks of not actually training people, and it's not always obvious what's happening. But yeah, I actually think it's a really tough world to be a leader in right now.
And have you seen, so in organizations that you work with, have you seen companies that do this well and set those parameters clearly and in a way that allows people to say, no, I'm not doing anymore, because they know that it affects their energy levels, their ability to perform?
I mean, certainly most of the people I work with at the moment are in the kind of SME world. And a lot of the entrepreneurs there do recognize that there is a need for flexibility. So this is the other thing that in terms of well-being is there's a big shift at the moment for people being called back into the offices 5 days a week. And this is also going to accelerate the exodus from the corporate world because people don't want to do that anymore. So enlightened entrepreneurs, MDs and CEOs recognize that we've gone through a bit of a change period in the last 5 years. People want flexibility. They don't want to be in the office 5 days a week. And if they are mandated to do that, they're not necessarily going to stay. But I do think, I mean, some of the companies have got it really nailed and there's a lot of flexibility and there's leadership development and that's really at the forefront. But there's this balance between, as always, the funds to do that and the return and how busy the business is. There's always this kind of triangle of, how urgent it is and the time and the deliverables. So
Yeah,
there are some very enlightened companies out there.
I think there are, absolutely. But it tends to often be the smaller ones, as you say, because I think they're closer to the teams from top to bottom by nature of their size, by definition. And so that they can see that. And you also, in smaller organizations, you have a better sense of what people are doing
Or not doing.
and what they're not doing.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's very clear. But it's interesting. I mean, this whole concept then around giving agency to people, because I mean, if we're treating people as adults, and let's face it, the recruitment process is for jobs these days are pretty grueling. They're pretty extended. There are some ludicrous numbers of interviews that people go through to get jobs. So you presume that by the time they've been placed in a job or you've got a job, the company's pretty keen on you, that they're pretty sure that they've picked the right person, and then they don't give them very much agency at all. And it seems to me there's a real dissonance, a friction there around that. And if we're not treated as adults, then we tend not to behave like adults. And so if you're not being given that agency, is that what's driving people out of corporates as well into the entrepreneurial world, do you think?
I think, it's a whole variety of things, really. And I think you're right. I mean, the recruitment process that you touched on, I mean, how ridiculous is it to take people through so many stages when the marketplace is very tight for talent? And, like you say, once you've got the offer and you're going to be onboarded, it doesn't stop there. That's just the beginning of the journey. So, it does happen a lot. You onboard people, they kind of arrive on day one and then it's like, oh, great, you're in the role. So now what? You can't afford to do that anymore. People have to hit the ground running. And if the more you can give them in terms of accelerating their learning, their ability to be a leader, the better they're going to be able to contribute to the organization from day one.
And what do you think that takes from the people in leadership role? I mean, the people who are doing the recruiting, the people who are onboarding. Is it just really courage as much as anything else? That
I think part of it it depends who's doing the recruiting, but I think part of it needs to be making a really robust recruitment process. It doesn't need to be long. I mean, I'm a trained advocate and use Psychometrics. You've got to use the right ones though. So Psychometrics is part of the recruitment process. Make it really easy for the candidate to like your business and on board onto your business. Don't put them through hoops and loops and more interviews and delays and ghosting and all the rest of it. So a part of it is knowledge of how to do recruitment well. And another thing is just, like you say, treat people as adults and with respect, because there's a lot of very disrespectful recruitment that goes on at the moment where, they don't even get response. Even at very senior level roles, there's no response going on at all.
Yeah. If you're on the being recruited side, I mean, we know that the most stressful thing always is not knowing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
One takes that into a health scenario. If you're told that you've got something wrong with you, then you can deal with it. But if you're told you haven't got the job or it's not going to happen, then you can deal with it. But it's the not knowing part is the debilitating part often.
I do think, though, that particularly leaders and managers in smaller businesses are now almost frightened to do anything because of all the legislation that's coming in. It's almost freezing and crippling people so that they're not sure what they can say, what they can do. Is that going to cause a problem? And it's almost taken out the human element of being able to have dialogues with people.
I think that's key. Yeah, that's only being dialed up at the moment with new legislation coming
Absolutely.
in this year, which I suppose suggests that there is room for a greater focus on these people skills, because that's part of
Absolutely.
it. You mentioned psychometric testing, and I'm always intrigued about that. I mean, do you use them in your work at the moment quite a bit, or?
Absolutely. So everybody that comes through our boot camp process to set up their business is profiled. So we're building up a history of what do entrepreneurs look like in the HR consulting world. So that's really interesting.
Can you
And
give us an insight into where you've got to
I
with that at the moment?
certainly can. So the three key motivators for people coming into consulting are freedom to do your own thing, which basically means they don't like being told what to do.
Or they've had
Um,
enough of being told
or
what to
had
do.
enough of being told what to do. They're motivated by learning and development. And they are creators. They like to come up with new ideas. So those are the top three motivators. In terms of personality, now this is a really interesting one. If you'd have asked me 5 years ago, what does a ideal consultant look like? It would be very different to what it is now. So with all of the AI, with the remote working, you don't necessarily have to be an extrovert, which is typically what many people associated with consultants in the past. You had to be out there, you had to do your facilitations, you had to do, networking and business development and all of that. There are lots of really good ways that you can do that now without actually being an extrovert. So that the ideal profile is not in concrete anymore. So what we do is we look at the profile and say, what kind of business best suits your profile, not the other way around.
Okay. Which seems like a more logical way. I mean,
It does, doesn't it? So
because the
we don't exclude people because they haven't got the right profile. It's like, okay, what works for you?
because the profile pre-exists, and you're not going to reshape that.
You're not going to change. So
No,
let's build on your strengths
build
and
around that.
and the elements that don't perhaps map on to some of the key things you need to do as a consultant. You can either delegate or you can get upskilled or something else, really.
So can I ask you which profiling psychometric platforms that do you go with? That do you like
Yeah,
to use?
absolutely.
We're not the BBC. We don't need to mention them all. So
Yeah, and many others as well.
and many others
No,
are
so,
available.
so the motivational tool that we use is motivational maps. And we use that extensively with not only our consultants, but our consulting clients as well. So at the moment, I'm running 5 senior leadership team building events where they're using the motivational maps, 360-degree feedback, and we use for the profiling, we use something called DISC, the DISC system.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, which
So
is
those three
well
in
known.
combination are really powerful when we're doing senior leadership team development. And it gives a huge insight to the individual and for the team. So I'm a
I mean,
great
my
advocate of them.
view around these things is they're really good establishing broad categories, and they're even better opening up conversations and letting people explore issues. But one has to be quite careful about how far one takes the sort of if you get a selection of 4 letters or a color or
Yeah.
whatever, and then build just on the basis of that.
Yeah.
What's your view around that?
Absolutely. And there's some really tight guidelines around how you use psychometrics, which ones fall within the kind of category of a psychometrics. They're not all psychometrics, some are just profiles. And in the UK, we have a governing body across them. So
Okay.
all the tools we use are all kind of accredited and signed off. And yes, you do get rogue clients that want to use them for the wrong purposes. So occasionally they'll say, oh, we want to do some leadership development, but actually what they're using them for is to select for redundancy.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
we're really cautious about who uses our profiling because we want everybody to have a good experience from it and to be used constructively.
Yeah. I mean, it's supposed to be a sort of positive insight
Yeah,
on
absolutely.
where you can grow and what you need to develop. So does that I mean, it clearly does translate across. I mean, you into mid-level leaders too. Uh,
Absolutely. And board
and
directors as well.
okay, the thing that seems to I'm sort of most aware of though is that there's often a and this is this goes back to, I suppose, what we were touching on earlier, is that people in the middle of organizations need skill sets which often are actually quite different to those at the top of organizations, and which people at the top of organizations may not have the ability to operate in mid-level. And yet everyone always sort of sees success being at the top of the pile rather than in the middle. And I think that there's a discussion to be had around that, which is get away from that idea that if you're at the top of the hierarchy, you might be really good at strategy and long distance range thinking and sort of big wide communication. And I suspect a little bit of charisma and extroversion is useful in parts there. Whereas in the middle of organizations, you need to be, you're much more in with others, and it's much more about, I mean, there's a degree of care there that on a personal basis, interpersonal basis, that is much more one-to-one than is perhaps generally required at the top of organizations. And I just think that we aren't necessarily giving people in the middle the credit for using those skills and championing those skills. Is that something that resonates with you?
I mean, certainly the middle managers are probably so central to getting the organization to be as good as it is. I mean, they are the kind of the link between the senior leadership or the board and the rest of the teams, but they're pulled in all directions. So if they're not getting the support and the leadership development and also the tools to do the job, so a lot of good companies are introducing great AI methodologies into their business that is really helping the middle managers kind of free up their time.
Tell us a
Interestingly,
little bit more about that. I mean, have you got a sort of example of what that might be?
yeah, well, there's in the press, there's a lot of companies that have now replaced things like customer service or key client-facing activities with chatbots. The accuracy of their advice to the clients is probably better than a human interaction. So although we're seeing a shift of, some roles are kind of shrinking and disappearing, from a leader's perspective, their time, I mean, not that many of them would admit to this, but a lot of them are using AI to create content for things like, dare I say it, performance management reviews, writing emails, writing reports, writing board reports. All of those things can be accelerated massively by using AI, as long as you're using it carefully and obviously
Responsibly.
checking responsibly. You can cut down the time of just creating and curating good content, and that frees up their time then to do other things, because I'm pretty sure the other thing that you can really do as a manager is, if you get a report or you get some really detailed analysis, you can then again use AI to say, what are the key points from this report? How does that impact X, Y, and Z? So you can really accelerate your ability to absorb information that has been fired at you probably from lots of different kind of areas, and really kind of make some sound judgment on it very quickly.
But it's a significant shift in work process, that though, isn't it? And it's interesting. I mean, I'm currently doing some research with big organizations, interviewing senior executives around how they're developing people to use AI in their organizations. And almost consistently, they're saying the problem, and this is reflected in the well-known MIT report that came out at the end of in July, I think it was last year, that said individually people's productivity and performance is improving because they're using AI. But we haven't managed to turn that into organizational improvement, and there's some disconnect between the two. And that is because in order to enable that, you need to change the culture and the work process and the workflows within organizations. And that's a really big task. So
it is a massive task, and we know that from ourselves, because we've just invested in using automations and processes for our business. And we're not a big business, but we know that having invested that amount of time, we're going to get rewards from it. But it kind of, you have to suddenly, it's like the chaos before the clarity.
yeah,
Everything
nice. Yeah, I like
changes,
that. Yeah.
and then you've got the clarity, which is fantastic. But you go through this horrible mess in
You
between,
sort of shook up
Well,
the bottle a bit. Yeah.
yes, it's like, whoa,
The,
was this a good idea to start? And I'm guessing obviously the bigger the organization and the corporate, it takes a massive logistics to get some of these processes in place.
well, that's where the consultants come into their own, presumably, is
Yeah.
in finding routes forward for that. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about Leap into HR Consulting. You said what? So you've been doing that for what, 4 or 5 years? Is that right, or longer?
So the consulting business, which is GlobusHR Consulting Ltd, is the limited business, and then we've got various brands within that, which is
Okay.
the most popular one is the Leap into HR Consulting. Um, so it came on the back of a lot of people. Every time I went in to do a consulting project, the HR team, somebody would typically say, "Well, I'd love to be a consultant. Can you give me a few tips on how I can do it?" So that's kind of how it started. And then I started doing boot camps, long weekends where I'd help them set up their business. And then of course we had the pandemic. And overnight it went from a face-to-face event to a virtual program, which we still run, which is a 6-week program. And we've launched over 300 businesses now in the last 5
Wow.
years. So,
Is that right?
so
Really?
yeah, so there's a lot of people leaving the corporate world, and we do about 60 new businesses a year at the moment.
And those are essentially sole traders. What, one man bands? Is it, or what?
They could be sole traders or they're limited companies, but they typically start off by themselves. But within 12 months, they've either got associates or they've got VA support. Some of our earlier boot campers from 5 years ago have now got teams, they've got offices.
All right.
They're doing really, really well.
They're doing
So,
really well.
yeah, yeah.
Do you think, I mean, it's clear from what you're saying is that people are looking to get out of that organizational sort of structure. Is there something organizations can do to retain them? Because these are obviously people with some get up and go and some innovation, and they're prepared to do new stuff. They're the kinds of people that organizations should want to have in their outfits. Is there something that can be done to sort of create space for these kinds of energies in organizations, do you think? Or is it inevitable that people are going to want to go off and work on their own or for
I think
themselves?
there are multiple factors at play here. And a lot of people, I mean, most of the people that come onto our boot camps, they're kind of head of HR, director level. They've been in HR probably 15, 20 years, worked their way up the ladder, got onto the board possibly. Typically, they kind of love what they do, but then you've got all of the other elements that come in. They don't feel valued. They're often sidelined in terms of conversations that are taking place, and they don't necessarily get to the core of some of those conversations. They hate the politics. They don't like the flexibility. A lot of them are women, and a lot of them have child responsibilities as well. I know we're supposed to be in an equal world now, but it's still not
It
equal.
still doesn't quite work. No.
Still doesn't quite work. So there's a lot of pressure on very senior HR professionals, and then you've got we're going to go back to the offices 5 days a week, which really doesn't help anybody that's ever been a parent to juggle the other commitments. So I think there's a whole load of factors at play. And people are beginning to question, well, actually, with the cost of living crisis as well, I think some people would rather just downsize where they live, have less pressure, have a better balance, and consulting can give them that flexibility and the income that they need. Not immediately sometimes, but over time it will give them what they want.
But because there is clearly a risk in coming out of
Yeah,
a job where
yeah.
you're paid at the end of each month and there are certain benefits and security nets, out into the entrepreneurial world where that really is a lot higher danger, particularly in those early stages.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you say that it's a higher risk, because at the moment, if you look in, particularly in our world of the HR world, is that a lot of senior HR people have been made redundant. So where they think they're safe and cozy in the corporate world, it's not actually that true at the moment. And at least when you've got your own business, you've got multiple clients. So, as long as you keep the balance going across them, you're not going to have the risk of losing your job overnight. So I think there is a fear factor, definitely. Is it going to work? Am I ever going to get any clients? I hate business development. How am I going to do that if I don't like to do selling? So yeah, there are some risks, but I think once they get into it, the rewards are great for them.
I think, yeah, I mean, I can say, being self-employed myself, I understand the excitement and attraction of that. But I think
Yeah.
there is also opportunity, and I haven't quite identified exactly how it works, where organizations should be able to make some of that become more available within the organizational structure. And I think that's probably a challenge that we need to embrace and explore a little bit more to see how we can do that.
And I think anybody that's keen to set their own business up, even to retain these senior people, why not let them work 3 days a week and let them run their business 2 days a week? The NHS allows people
Yeah.
to have private practice as well as the NHS.
Yeah.
You're bringing all this additional expertise and knowledge into the business because you're working with more than one company. And then you're retaining the consistency with having somebody at a senior level. You can backfill that space with, other support for those other 2 days that might be needed. So
And have you seen that happening? Because I think that sounds like a really sensible way
I know, I know.
of trying to retain that. There's a lot of sort of institutional knowledge, institutional memory that
Exactly.
people have, and when they've left, that they've by and large left. And
Yeah.
if they've left because they've been made redundant, well, they don't feel very much loyalty to the business in any case. So that middle ground, I would just wonder if you've seen that being done
There is
well.
a lot in terms of people that come on the boot camp. They're kind of like, oh, I haven't resigned yet. When do I resign? And we say, well, actually, don't resign. Have a conversation when you're ready for it. Have a conversation about reducing your days, reducing your hours. And a lot of people are very worried about having those conversations, it's fair to say. But I would say probably 80% of those conversations have led them to reduce their hours and have their business.
Yeah.
And they've got the best of both worlds. They've got the stability from the corporate world. They've still got the continuity of working with the company they really, most of the time they like, but they've then got this creative element where they can work with other clients and do other work that they're happier about doing.
Yeah. And the great advantage of having people with a sort of consultancy portfolio is that you're going to benefit from what they're seeing in other organizations too. Because a big risk in organizations is that people aren't looking externally enough and seeing what else is going on elsewhere. And so you're bringing ideas in. Let's see how that transformation goes. Sarah, it's been fantastic speaking to you. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed that.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Roddy.